Nobody who has worked rock will tell you the rock is alive, but every one of them treats it like it is, and that is the part the Atrian could never get into their heads. I spent 11 standard years on Sevath, in the Vale Cut, with a crew of 9 and one foreman who answered to me, which was me, because I never could keep a foreman who'd take the job twice. The Atrian called us the labor allotment. They had a tidier word in their own speech that the translators rendered as diggers, and they did not mean it kindly. You can tell a lot about a species by the words it makes ugly. To them, digging was a thing animals did with their faces. I should explain about the Atrian, because if you have not met them, you will picture them wrong. They are tall and narrow and built in too many sections, like a question that keeps adding clauses, and they move with a precision that is genuinely beautiful to watch and genuinely unsettling to stand next to. What you have to understand is that no Atrian on Sevath had touched raw material with their own body in something like 9 generations. It was not that they couldn't. It was that they had decided, a long time ago, that a civilized hand does not close on unprocessed matter. They wore field gloves, emitter sleeves that let them lift and turn and place things at a polite distance, so that the world never had to make actual contact with them. They ate processed. They built by drone. And they mined, this is the part that matters, they mined the Vale Cut entirely by remote. It was a good operation. I'll say that plainly so you don't think this is a story about fools. The Atrian are not fools. The Vale Cut went after a seam of Vaughan, which is a conducting ore so clean and so rare that a finger length of it will run a city block, and they took it out of Sevath with bore drones the size of cattle, a swarm of them, each one reading the face with 100 senses and chewing forward on a schedule you could set a clock by. Behind the drones they ran field-set shoring. They did not brace the tunnels with timber or steel the way we did. They held the rock up with light. Lattices of force, emitter anchored, a geometry of held pressure so exact that the displayed margins never wavered. They were proud of those margins. They had a word for the number that never wavered, and they said it the way other species say a prayer. And every so often the schedule and the geometry would meet a stretch of ground that the drones did not like, broken strata, water, a fault the sensors flagged as a question mark, and the Atrian would, with visible distaste, send for us. The first time I met Overseer Ole, he watched me come up out of the cut, and he did not step back from me, which I came to understand was him being polite, because every cell in him wanted to. I was filthy. That is the condition of my trade. There is dust in the creases of your hands that does not come out in this life, and there is a smell to a man who has been down a deep cut all shift, the smell of cut rock in your own work, and Ole stood in it on purpose to show me he could. "You went in," he said. He had a way of stating the obvious as if it were a confession he was helping you make. "That's the job," I said. "Our reading shows the face is stable for another 40 hours. "Your reading's reading a number," I said. "I'm telling you what it sounded like." He had translators for the words and none for the meaning. Sounded like. He filed it the way you file a thing a child says. I watched him decide very fairly, very precisely, that I was a creature that put its body where its instruments should be because it had never been given instruments, and that there was something almost sad in it, and that he would be patient with me because patience was a thing a high species owed a low one. I want to be honest about how that lands, because the easy story is that it made me angry and I burned for the day I'd show them. It didn't, and I didn't. I was 40-some years into a life of being underestimated by people who'd never been underground, and the rock had long since taught me that what anybody thinks of you while you work is the least load-bearing thing in the shaft. I let Ole have his pity. Pity is cheaper than respect, and it asks less of you. I went and got coffee. We shipped our own. The Atrian found the practice unspeakable, and I told Boots what the face had sounded like. And Boots, who was 70 and had been reading rock since before I was a wet idea, said, "Water behind it," and I said, "That's what I thought." And that was the whole of the conversation, and it was more mining than the Atrian did in a quarter. Let me tell you about my crew, since they're the ones who matter and the Atrian never bothered to learn a name. Boots Calder was the oldest hand any of us had ever worked beside. He'd lost 2 fingers off his left hand a long time before Sevath, and he could still read a face better with the 3 he had left than the whole drone swarm could with 100 senses. The Atrian found his hand fascinating and revolting in equal measure, and could not stop looking at it, which Boots enjoyed enormously. Petra Hale ran our rigging and our hand winches, the old mechanical kind, because she did not trust her life to anything that needed a clean power feed, and she had been proven right enough times that nobody argued. Tomas Oak was my timberman. Yes, timber. We shored with physical bracing, real members, set by hand, wedged and keyed, and the Atrian thought this was the single most primitive thing about us, holding a roof up with sticks like cave dwellers, and Tomas let them think it. And Tomas could put a set of timbers under a bad roof in the dark, in the time it took an emitter rig to finish its self-check. There were others, Devlin, who was young and learning, Sukai and Iabo and Ren and Marchetti, all good, all the kind of quiet competent that nobody films, but those 3, Boots and Petra and Tomas, are the ones you need for the rest of it. For the first years it ran the way I told you. The Atrian dug their clean schedule with their clean drones behind their clean light, and the margins never wavered, and when the ground got mean they sent for the diggers and we went into the part of the cut their machines wouldn't, and we did the work nobody could see was hard because we made it look like nothing, which is the curse of doing it well. And Ole stood at the collar of the shaft in his emitter sleeves and pitied us, and I drank my coffee, and the Vaughan came up clean. The trouble started, the way it always starts, with the operation being too good. The margins were so reliable that Sevath's holding came under pressure to push the schedule, and a pushed schedule is a thing the Atrian were beautifully equipped to deliver, because their whole method was speed with precision, and a human method is never going to win a race against light. So they pushed. The drone swarm ran faster. The field set shoring leapfrogged forward in the same exact geometry, only sooner, and the parts of the cut that used to get handed to us, the broken ground, the water, the question marks, started getting field set instead, because field set was faster and the margins on it still didn't waver. I'm telling you about the margins because the margins are the whole story. The Atrian trusted them the way you trust the floor, and a field set lattice is, I will grant, an astonishing thing. It holds a roof with no member touching rock, a pure-held geometry, and the gauge reads the same green number hour after hour after hour. But here is the thing about a held geometry that the Atrian, in 9 generations of not touching anything, had managed to forget, or had never had to learn, because forgetting is a luxury of never having had your hand on the work. A force lattice holds perfectly until it doesn't, and then it doesn't all at once. Timber doesn't do that. Timber talks. Bad timber groans, it spits, it weeps dust, it shows you the load coming for a long time before it lets go, and a timberman who's awake gets his men out on the warning. A field lattice gives you a green number and a green number and a green number, and then it gives you the floor of the sky. I tried to say this. I want it on the record that I tried, not so I look good, because looking good is not a thing the Rock has ever paid me for, but because the trying is part of what happened. There's a stretch of the Vale cut we called the Wet Drift, where the seam ran under a body of dead water trapped in the strata above, and it had always been handled by hand because the rock there was wrong in a way the sensors read as fine. It read as fine because the fault that ran through it was tight, closed, pressed shut, no gap for an instrument to find, and a closed fault is the most dangerous kind, because it is a thing that wants to move and is only waiting to be given room. You cannot measure want. You can only feel it, and you feel it through your boots and through the handle of a tool laid against the face, and through some sense that lives below thinking, that old hands have and can't explain and don't try to. I felt it the day the schedule pushed the field set into the Wet Drift, and I went up out of the cut and found Ole. "You're field setting the Wet Drift," I said. "The drift is on the accelerated geometry," he said. "The reading is stable, 81 hours of margin. There's a closed fault under the dead water, I said. It's tight now. You bring a field set up against it and load it on a fast schedule. You're going to take the press off it that's holding it shut. It'll have room it didn't have. I want timber in there and I want it slow. He looked at me with what I had come to recognize as genuine care, which was the worst of it, because contempt you can ignore and care you have to answer. Foreman Marsh, he said. He had learned my name by then. It was on the allotment manifest. I understand that your methods require you to feel the rock. I am not mocking you, but I cannot run an operation on a feeling. The fault you describe does not register. The margin is 81 hours and does not waver. If I held the schedule every time a being felt something, the cut would never advance. The margin doesn't waver, I said, because the thing that's going to break it doesn't register on the thing that draws the margin. That's not comfort. That's the whole danger. And here is the moment I think about, because Ole was not a cruel creature and he was not stupid, and he heard me, and he weighed it the only way 9 generations had left him able to weigh anything against the gauge. The gauge said green. The being in front of him, dirty, smelling of his own work, said red, and offered as evidence a feeling in his boots. Ole chose the gauge. Anyone reading a gauge would have chosen the gauge. That is exactly why the gauge is so dangerous. I'll note your concern in the allotment record, he said. He meant it generously. He was giving my feeling a place to live in the official file, which to him was a kind of respect. Note it loud, I said, and I went and pulled my people back from the working faces near the wet drift, all of them, every shift on my own authority, which I was technically allowed and which cost the holding metrics and which Ole, to his credit, let me do, because he could afford to indulge a superstition that only slowed the diggers. For 9 days the margin read green and did not waver, and Ole was right, and I was a man who had stopped his crew over a feeling. And I will tell you that even Boots, who never doubts a face, gave me a look on about day 6, and I started to wonder if 11 years had finally turned my boots into liars. The rock makes you doubt yourself. It is patient about it. On the 10th day, the wet drift let go. I was at the collar when it happened, which is the only reason I can tell you about it, and what I remember first is not sound but the absence of it. The cut has a constant noise, the drones, the air handling, the hum of the field set lattices, a sound so steady you stop hearing it the way you stop hearing your own heart. It stopped. Not faded, stopped between one breath and the next, and in the silence that was suddenly enormous I heard the thing under it, which was the rock, which had begun to move. A field lattice doesn't fail like timber. There's no groan, no warning weep of dust. The wet drift's fault, given room at last by the press the fast schedule had pulled off it, slipped. A closed fault moving is not a crack. It's the whole drift shifting along a plane you couldn't see, and the slip put a load on the field set lattice that the geometry was never asked to hold, a sideways shearing load instead of the clean down press it was tuned for, and the lattice did what a perfect held geometry does when you ask it the one question it can't answer. It went out. All of it. Not one anchor at a time. All at once, the entire run of field set shoring through the wet drift and back along the accelerated geometry, the whole green number going to nothing in less time than it takes to say it, and 1,200 meters of roof that had been held up by light discovered it was no longer being held up by anything. The dead water came down with the roof. That's the part that turned a collapse into a tomb. The trapped body of water in the strata, with the rock that had dammed it suddenly gone, poured into the cut and met the dust and the broken field emitters still arcing, and made a thing down there that no drone could go into and no sensor could read. A drowned, dust-blind, electrically screaming wreck of a drift with the roof still working itself down in the dark. And below it, past the collapse, in the deep faces, the accelerated schedule had pushed the Atrian's own remote operations crew forward to monitor in person, because even the Atrian, when the metrics matter enough, will put a few of their precious bodies near the work. There were 11 Atrian, trapped, below the wet drift, behind 1,200 meters of what used to be a tunnel, in a pocket of standing ground with the water rising and the air going, and no way out that any of their methods could reach. I want to describe the next part exactly, because it's the part the title of this is built on, and because if I get it wrong it sounds like a story about clever humans beating dumb aliens, and it was nothing of the kind. It was a story about a species that had built itself so far away from the work that when the work turned on them, they had no body to put against it, and a species that had stayed close enough to the work to be filthy with it, and what those two things meant when the gauge went dark. The Atrian response was immediate, and it was, by their own lights, correct. They surged the drone swarm into the collapse. They were not paralyzed. I have heard the slander since, that they froze, and it isn't true. They moved fast and they moved smart, and every single thing they did was the right move for the world they came from. They sent the borers in to clear the fall. They tried to re-establish a field-set lattice across the break to stabilize it. They flooded the wreck with sensor drones to find their 11. And none of it worked, because none of it could. The borers are precision instruments. They read a face and chew a programmed line, and they are magnificent in clean ground, and they are useless, actively useless in a collapse. They hit the chaos of a fall, the void and the loose and the standing water and the still working roof, and their precision became a liability, because a borer cannot improvise. A borer asks the rock to be the shape it was told the rock would be, and a fall is the rock being every shape at once. The first borers installed, confused, sat there reading a situation they had no program for, and the ones that didn't stall made it worse, chewing into loose ground and bringing more down. They had to pull the swarm. The field-set lattice wouldn't re-establish. You can't anchor light to ground that's moving, and the wet drift was still moving, still settling, still finding its new shape, and an emitter needs a known geometry to hold, and the geometry was now unknowable. Every attempt to set a lattice across the break collapsed the instant it touched the live rock, because the rock would not hold still to be measured, and a thing that needs to measure before it acts cannot act on ground that won't be measured. And the sensor drones, this is the one that broke the Atrian, I think, the one they could not have anticipated. The sensor drones went into the wreck and went blind. The dust, the water, the arcing emitters, the scream of 100 failed field anchors all shorting at once. It was a fog to every sense they had. They flew their 100-sense drones into the place, their 11 were trapped, and the drones came back knowing nothing, because the place had become, in an afternoon, the one kind of place their entire civilization had engineered itself never to have to enter. A place you could only know by being in it, with a body in the dark by feel. Ole came to the collar. I had never seen an Atrian move the way he moved, fast and graceless, the precision gone out of him. He came to where I was standing with my crew, all 9 of us in our gear, because we had geared up the second the hum stopped without anyone giving an order, the way you do when you've spent your life listening for that silence. He stood in front of me. I will give him this until the day I die. He did not waste a second on his pride. A lot of beings in front of the ones they'd pitied would have spent at least a sentence on the climb down. Ole spent none. The drift is impassable to every method we have, he said. There are 11 of my people below the fall. The water is rising. We cannot reach them. Our drones are blind in the wreck, and our field set will not anchor on moving ground, and our borers cannot work a collapse. He stopped, and then he said the thing his whole species had spent 9 generations making sure it would never have to say. You go in, with your bodies, into ground like that. Can you reach them? It wasn't really a question. It was an account, finally, fully paid, of everything I'd been trying to tell him at the collar for years, and I could have made him pay it in coin. There was a sentence sitting right there, an easy one, the one everybody wants to say at the moment the gauge goes dark, and the man who read the gauge has to come to the man who read the rock. I'm a man, and the sentence was sweet, and it was true, and I had earned it. I didn't say it. I want to be clear that this isn't a virtue. It's just that I have been underground a long time, and the rock has worn the wanting to be right out of me the way water wears a handhold. And the truth is there were 11 people below a fall with the water coming up, and a sentence you can't dig with is just air you wasted breathing. The rock does not care who was right. It is the one honest thing in the operation. You answer to it or you don't, and everything else is noise the surface makes. Maybe, I said, get out of the way and let me look. We looked. That is the first thing, and it is the thing no machine could do, not because the machines were weak but because looking, real looking, is a thing a body does with everything it has and a sensor does with one channel at a time. Boots and I went to the lip of the fall, as close as the ground would let us, and we stood in the dust and the dark with the standing water lapping somewhere below and the roof ticking over our heads, and we did not look at a gauge. We laid our hands on the rock. We laid the handles of our bars against the face and put our ears to the steel and listened to what was talking through it. We watched the dust to see how the air moved, because air tells you where the voids are. We felt, through our boots, the difference between ground that had finished moving and ground that was still thinking about it. It settled along the bottom of the fall, Boots said after a while. Top still live. There's a void run along the footwall, you hear it. Water's found it. If they're alive, they're past the void in the standing ground at the old deep face. We can go along the footwall void if we keep under the live top. We'll have to take the top down to do it, I said. Hand it down, controlled. Lie. It'll be slow. It'll be slow, Boots agreed. And it'll be us and we'll all come back up, which the drones won't so. That was the whole plan. I know it sounds like nothing. The Atrian, standing behind us, could not believe it was the whole plan. They were a species that planned in modeled detail, that ran 1,000 projections before lifting a finger by glove. And here were two filthy humans deciding by hand and ear to crawl along a water-filled void under a live roof, and calling it a plan. Ole asked me, and I could hear the strain of him asking it, what our confidence interval was. Our what? Boots said. I told Ole we'd know if it was working by whether we were still alive, and that this was the only honest number anyone had ever offered him, and Ole, and I respect him for this, took it. He did not argue for the gauge. The gauge had had its say, and it had cost him 11 people's roof. He stood back and he let the diggers work. Here is what going in is, since the Atrian never knew and most surface folk never know. You go in on your belly and your hands. Tomas went first behind me with the timber. We hand-carried members down to the fall, real wood and steel. Because the one thing you can set against a live roof that won't fail all at once is a physical brace that talks. And Tomas set them as we went, keying each one, wedging it, listening to it take the load and tell us how much load there was. You move with the roof, not against it. You take it down where it wants to come down, a little at a time, controlled, so that it never gets to do all at once what the field set let it do. You read the void by the sound of the water and the feel of the draft, and you follow it on faith, and on 3 decades of other voids that taught you what this one was about to do. It took us 9 hours. I won't pretend it was anything but the worst 9 hours of my working life, and I have had bad ones. The water rose the whole time. The roof worked the whole time, and twice it tried to take the decision away from us, and twice Tomas's timber held it long enough to give it back. Petra ran a hand line behind us, mechanical, no power feed, because Petra does not trust her people's lives to a clean feed. And Petra had been right about that for 30 years and was right about it that day, when every emitter in the cut was dead or screaming, and her hand-cranked winch and her braided line were the only thing moving in the whole drowned dark that worked. Devlin, the young one, cried at one point quietly and kept setting timber while he did it, and nobody said anything about it because it was the correct response to where we were, and the only thing wrong would have been to stop. We reached the 11 Atrian in their pocket of standing ground at the old deep face with the water at their bottom joints. And I will tell you the thing I remember most clearly out of the whole 11 years, which is the way they looked at us when our lamps came around the last of the footwall void. They were not built to be touched, 9 generations, and we got them out by touching them, by closing our filthy hands on them, on the matter of them, lifting them, carrying them, dragging them on our backs through a void too low to stand in with the water coming up and the roof talking, hand over hand on Petra's line. We could not be polite about it. There was no field glove distance to keep. We put our bare hands on the Atrian and got them out of the dark with our bodies, the one thing their whole civilization had built itself never to need, and not one of them flinched from it, because the deepest part of a being, below 9 generations of anything, knows the hand that pulls it out of the dark and does not call it primitive. We brought all 11 up. We brought all 9 of us up. The last one out was Boots, because Boots is always the last one out, that being a rule older than the cut, and he came up filthy and 3-fingered and 70 and entirely unbothered. And the first thing he said on the surface was that the wet drift had been telling us for 10 days and somebody ought to have listened, which was the closest any of us came to saying the easy sentence, and even that he said to the rock, not to Ole. The recalibration when it came was not a grovel, and I'm glad of that, because a grovel would have been the wrong size for what happened. Ole came to me at the collar after, when the 11 were up and stable, and the cut was sealed off to settle, and he stood in my work smell on purpose again, but it was a different on purpose now. He had decided to stand in the thing he had found distasteful, and to keep standing in it, as a correction he was making to himself in public. The margin read green, he said. It was not a defense. He was working something out. It read green the whole time. It was a true reading of the thing it measured, and the thing it measured was not the thing that mattered. That's the trade, I said. A gauge gives you a number that never lies about a small thing. A man gives you a feeling that's right about a big one and can't prove it. You can run a fast, clean operation on the first and you can stay alive on the second, and you'd best know which one you're doing at any given hour. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, we had stopped being able to feel the rock. We engineered it out generations ago. We called it advancement. And then, with a precision returning to him that was somehow worse than the gracelessness had been, because it was the precision of a being looking straight at a true thing. We did not advance past needing to feel the rock. We advanced past being able to, and we told ourselves it was the same thing. I didn't answer that because there wasn't an answer that was mine to give. It was his to sit in. I went and got coffee, and this time Ole asked, with a care that had nothing of pity left in it, whether he might stand near while I drank it in the smell of the work, and I said it was a free collar. They kept us on after. They kept us on for the rest of the seam, and they changed the schedule. Not back to slow exactly, but to something that had both things in it, the gauge and the hand, the light and the timber, the fast, clean way for the clean ground and the diggers for the ground that was thinking about moving. And the margins on the new schedule wavered more and the cut advanced slower, and not one more being dyed in the veil. And Ole came to consider this an improvement in a way that I think genuinely cost his species something to learn, and which I think was worth what it cost. I've been asked since I came off Sevath whether it felt good the day the ones who'd called us diggers had to come on graceless legs and ask the diggers to dig. People wanted to have felt good. They want the sweet sentence I didn't say. They want the gauge reader brought low and the rock reader raised up. They want the score settled. I'll tell you what it felt like. It felt like 9 hours on your belly in rising water under a roof that wanted you, hand over hand on Petra's line, with Tomas setting timber behind you and Devlin crying and setting timber, and at the end of it, 11 people who weren't built to be touched alive because you touched them. There's no settling a score in that. There's no being right. There's just the rock, which doesn't care, and the work, which doesn't lie, and a crew that came back up because it never forgot how to put its body where its instruments should be. The Atrian have a word now for the thing we did. The translators won't render it. They say it doesn't map. Boots asked one of the 11 what it meant, the new word, and the answer that came back, after a long pause from a being still learning to say it, was that it meant something like the ones who go down, not the diggers, the ones who go down. I've had worse names. I've had worse jobs, too, and better, but I never had one that was more honest than the rock, and I never will. And when people ask me what I learned in 11 years on Sevath, I tell them the only thing the cut ever taught me, which is that a gauge is a fine thing and a feeling is a finer one, and that any species that builds itself too far from the work to get its hands dirty had better pray it never has to go down, because the day the gauge goes dark, the only ones who come back up are the ones who never stopped being able to. We're none of us as advanced as we think. We're just close to the work or we're not. And the rock keeps the only record that ever mattered, and it doesn't waver, and it doesn't pity, and it doesn't lie, and one day it'll have us all. And until then, the honest thing, the only honest thing, is to listen when it talks. It was telling us for 10 days. Somebody ought to have listened.